When you think of the resistance forces of the Second World War, it's likely that the French resistance and the Polish Home Army come to mind. But what about the occupied resistance fighters in Axis-occupied Yugoslavia, specifically the Yugoslav Partisans? This organization was enormous, a veritable army and highly effective. And we don't think it gets the attention it deserves. In this video, we hope to rectify that. After Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria joined the Axis, Hitler set his sights on Yugoslavia, and Yugoslavia's Prince Paul soon declared that he would bend the knee. Many in Yugoslavia, especially the Serbians, were not happy about this. On the 27th of March 1941, a coup d'etat saw Prince Paul dethroned and replaced by King Peter II. This infuriated Hitler, who issued Führer Directive 25 on the same day. In answer to the coup d'etat, he would, quote, destroy Yugoslavia militarily as a state with pitiless harshness and without waiting for possible declarations of loyalty of the new government. On the 6th of April 1941, Germany, Italy, and Hungary launched their invasion of Yugoslavia. All told, this Axis force included 19 German divisions, 22 Italian divisions, and the Hungarian Third Army. The sky was all but blacked out, with more than 1,900 aircraft flying in support of the Axis ground force. Conversely, some 700,000 soldiers of the Royal Yugoslav Army stood in defense of the state, while up to 500 Yugoslav planes patrolled the sky. In just 12 days, the Germans alone had captured as many as 345,000 Yugoslavs, and the state had been shattered. The Serbian capital, Belgrade, was bombed into submission, with 17,000 residents killed. The Yugoslavs had truly no idea how hard Hitler would hit them. A brutal occupation followed, with Yugoslavia split into territories occupied or annexed to Germany, Italy, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Albania. The Axis troops gunned down or hung people at will. They burned houses and sometimes entire villages to the ground and rehoused the expelled Yugoslavs in concentration camps. In the German-occupied zones, if someone slew a German soldier, the Germans would slaughter 100 Yugoslav hostages in response. In Mussolini's words, the best situation is when the enemy is dead, so we must take numerous hostages and shoot them whenever necessary. With Yugoslavia torn apart and atrocities like these taking place on the regular, many Yugoslavs felt they had no choice but to resist the occupying forces by violent means. In fact, the leader of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, a man named Josip Broz Tito, had been establishing an underground network and amassing weapons since the Axis forces first stepped foot in Yugoslavia. He would not, however, engage the Axis in open warfare because to do so, he would need Soviet support, and the USSR was currently upholding a non-aggression pact with Germany. In June 1941, Hitler launched his invasion of the USSR, and everything changed. Now, Tito could step out of the shadows and wage a guerrilla war against the Axis. Together, his forces were known as the Yugoslav Partisans, or officially, the National Liberation Partisan Detachment of Yugoslavia. The Partisans had two main goals: defeat the occupying forces and turn Yugoslavia into a federal, multi-ethnic communist state. However, the Partisans were not the only resistance force operating in Yugoslavia. As Tito had risen, so too had Draža Mihailović. This Yugoslavian Serb was the leader of a loose collective of resistance fighters known as the Chetnik detachments of the Yugoslav army, or simply the Chetniks. Instead of communism, the Chetniks stood in support of the Yugoslav monarchy and Serbia itself. They were stoutly nationalistic. As you might expect, the Partisans and Chetniks didn't get along so well. It didn't help that the Chetniks collaborated with the Axis powers pretty much whenever it suited them, while also, in a supreme act of juggling, keeping the Western allies on their side for much of the war. With that said, there were times when the Partisans and Chetniks fought together against the Axis, and we'll get to that in just a moment. For now, Tito's first uprising kicked off on the 4th of July 1941, and the first bullet was fired on the 7th in what became known as the Bela Crkva incident. Here, in Serbia, a dozen partisans, led by a man named Zakicha Jovanovic Spanac, gunned down 2 Yugoslav gendarmes who were serving the enemy by enforcing the ban on political rallies. After the deed was done, Jovanovic said, "This is how all those who will serve their occupier will pass." From that incident until the end of November, Serbia was in uproar, and for 3 of those 4 months, the partisans and Chetniks fought side by side against the Germans, who made both resistance organizations pay dearly. At the end of the uprising, some 4,000 partisans and Chetniks had been slain, and in reprisal for some 600 German casualties, the Germans massacred 35,000 Yugoslav civilians. To top it off, the rift that had been growing between the partisans and Chetniks throughout the uprising grew inconsolable in early November, when Mihailovic surrendered to the Germans and turned on the partisans. In mid-November, for example, the Chetniks captured 365 partisans and handed them over to the Germans, who executed them or sent them to suffer and die in concentration camps. The Germans may have defeated the partisans in this first uprising, but the war was not over, and over the next year and a half, surviving 4 major Axis offensives, the partisans swelled in number. We're not sure how many partisans Tito commanded by mid-1943, but by late 1944, it's argued that that figure was around 650,000. Returning to mid-1943, British historian Basil Davidson had this to say about the situation in Yugoslavia. At this stage, the partisan resistance to the Germans and their allies had grown from the dimensions of a mere nuisance to those of a major factor in the general situation. In many parts of occupied Europe, the enemy was suffering losses at the hands of partisans that he could ill afford. Nowhere were these losses heavier than in Yugoslavia. In May, the Axis forces launched their 5th major offensive against the partisans, codenamed Case Black. This involved some 127,000 Axis troops and 22,000 partisans. And despite the Axis forces' numerical superiority, the Axis failed to capture the partisans in the giant noose they had set. German General Rudolf Lütters chalked the Axis failure up to the partisans being well organized, skillfully led, and of unbelievably high combat morale. The partisans had taken some 7,500 casualties, about a third of their starting strength, but the battle proved that the war could be won. The partisans, after all, were fighting for their home. In Basil Davidson's words, "It was the nature of partisan resistance that operations against it must either eliminate it altogether or leave it potentially stronger than before, with the backing of a population which had come to see no alternative to resistance but death, imprisonment, or starvation." Following Italy's surrender, the Axis launched one or more major offensive against the partisans that year. This was Operation Kugelblitz, in which the Germans, Chetniks, and Bulgarians issued the partisans a significant defeat. In December, however, while Kugelblitz was still raging, something massive happened. The Western Allies, sick of the Chetniks' two-timing, dumped them in favor of the Yugoslav partisans. With Britain, the United States, and the USSR now backing Tito, the partisans were looking stronger than ever. The failure of the 7th and final major Axis offensive launched against them was a testament to this. From May 1944 until the end of the war, the partisans were the ones on the offensive. Looking to cement his power while his men pressed the attack, Tito signed an agreement with the aforementioned King Peter. The agreement stipulated that the new Yugoslav government would include communists and royalists, and that the government would recognize Tito's partisans as Yugoslavia's regular army. Tito further cemented his power, particularly with the Western Allies, by assisting the evacuation of downed Allied airmen from Yugoslavia in 1944. Among these rescue operations, Halyard was perhaps the most famous, though it wasn't the only operation of its kind. We've covered this topic in depth in a previous video, but what's important to today's video is that Tito's partisans assisted in the rescue of as many as 795 downed Allied airmen throughout the year, whereas the Chetniks rescued about half as many. According to American Rear Admiral Thomas T. Matesso, supporting the Allies in these operations was the Chetniks' only means of reversing the partisan takeover. To that end, their efforts were in vain. In September 1944, While Operation Halyard was still in effect, the nigh unstoppable partisans began a massive march on Belgrade alongside the Red Army and summarily freed the city from the Germans. At this point, things were looking terrible for the Germans in Yugoslavia. Well, things were looking terrible for the Germans everywhere. To quote our friend Basil one last time, every German unit which could safely evacuate from Yugoslavia might count itself lucky. In 1945, with some 800,000 partisans under his command, Tito defeated the armed forces of the independent state of Croatia and the Germans in Croatia, marched on and seized Trieste, and then fought one of the last battles of the Second World War in Europe, the Battle of Poljana. Here, on the 14th and 15th of May, several days after Germany had officially surrendered, the partisans crushed a retreating Axis column some 30,000 men strong. After the war was won, the surviving Chetnik forces were dissolved, King Peter was deposed, and partisans were reorganized into the regular armed forces of the newly formed Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia, which was led by Tito. What happened between then and the breakup of Yugoslavia in the early 1990s is a story for another time.
When war came to Denmark in 1940, the government surrendered almost immediately and without much of a fight. But that did not mean the Danish people were ready to turn in their weapons and become good little Nazis. They fought back. This is the story of the Danish Resistance and of those who fought to the last to preserve their freedom. When the Second World War began in September 1939, Denmark declared neutrality. Over 1.5 million Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and SS troops marched into Poland, and the Danish government knew that if a similar-sized force was turned on them, they had no hope of holding the line. While relatively well-equipped, the entire Royal Danish Army comprised around 14,500 soldiers, and pancake-flat Denmark has very little terrain suited for defense. Acknowledging Denmark's proximity to Germany and Hitler's expansionist mindset, the Danish parliament decided that a last-ditch fight to hold the border would do nothing except anger the invaders and get good Danes killed. On April 9th, 1940, the Wehrmacht invaded as part of Operation Viseruba, the joint operation to capture both Denmark and Norway. In the east, Luftwaffe Me-110s annihilated the Danish Air Force on the ground, while in the north, German Fallschirmjäger made the first airborne attack in history, capturing Storström Bridge and Masnado Fortress. German infantry made amphibious landings around the capital, Copenhagen. Within hours, Denmark ceased all resistance and surrendered. By the end of the day, all Danish forces had been disarmed. It was the shortest German military operation of the war. From the outside, it looked like Denmark had simply given up the ghost, but this couldn't have been further from the truth. The quick surrender was, in reality, a clever ploy to win German trust, and it worked. The Danish parliament knew that Danes featured near the top of the Nazi racial hierarchy. They played this to their advantage, convincing the Germans they were willing partners rather than a conquered people. Hitler was fooled and effectively let the Danes govern themselves. Denmark's politicians put aside their differences and united. With support from the king, they managed to block most Nazi policy at the legislative level, saving thousands from the Holocaust. In return, they agreed to officially curtail free press, which people quickly circumvented by publishing unofficial newspapers. Similarly, German demands to legislate the death penalty for anti-Nazi agitation and sabotage were shot down. In return for cooperation, the Nazis in Berlin let Denmark remain a so-called special case. But wheels were turning behind the scenes. The Danes hadn't yet given up and weren't about to let their country go without a fight. The first sparks of resistance came from the demobilized Royal Danish Army. Before surrendering, soldiers buried secret weapons caches in multiple locations across the country. Danish mariners voyaging overseas joined the Allied merchant fleet, and over 1,000 gave their lives on board Danish freighters during the Battle of the Atlantic. Closer to home, the Danish intelligence service set up a clandestine headquarters in Stockholm, in neutral Sweden. This was used as a base for Danish intelligence operatives to smuggle documents and intel out of occupied territory to the British. Sometimes, Danish agents went too, disappearing from German officers and later reappearing in the ranks of SOE. After the liberation of Denmark in 1945, Field Marshal Montgomery stated that the intelligence Britain received from the Danes had been second to none. But there were also those who chose violence. In 1942, 5 veterans of the Finnish Winter War formed a resistance group called Holger Dansk, named after the folk hero Ogier the Dane. Each of the men had served in the Danish Volunteer Brigade and knew the essentials of guerrilla warfare. They contacted old comrades and patriots and together built a resistance network numbering over 300 members. 2 of those members became infamous across Denmark and Germany as a cunning assassination team. They were known as the Flame and the Lemon. Jørgen Hagen Schmidt joined Holger Dansk in 1943, the year Danish resistance began ramping up. He didn't look like a caricature of bravado, but instead was described by Gunnar Drieberg, the leader of the resistance, as a dark-haired, well-built man of middle height, looked like an ordinary family man of 34. Schmidt's ordinary appearance likely helped him to avoid suspicion, which helped him survive at the top of the Gestapo's most wanted list. In July, Schmidt participated in a firebombing attack on a Citroën garage commandeered for German military use. Inside the building were 6 German cars and an armored vehicle, all of which were destroyed in the ensuing blaze. News of the successful attack quickly spread through Danish underground newspapers, boosting the morale of Denmark's resistance fighters. They called the man behind the attack Citroën, or in English, Lemon, in honor of his feat. Now furnished with a nom de guerre, the Lemon teamed up with another notable renegade and got on with the real business.
Killing Nazis.
The Lemon's partner in crime was Bent Farskofid, better known as Flammen, or Flame, for his shock of bright red hair. He was just as volatile as his name suggested. The Flame was Holger Dansk's executioner. He was an expert assassin and utilized a variety of weapons from a personal armory of captured German pistols and ammunition, Sten submachine guns airdropped by British SOE, military rifles cached from the invasion, improvised petrol bombs, and grenades. When he and the Lemon made a hit, Lemon would drive while Flame executed their target. The 2 men worked excellently together, managing to kill no less than 22 German officials and Danish collaborators. They also undertook their fair share of sabotage and intelligence gathering missions. By August 1943, it was becoming clear the Danes weren't really collaborating with the Germans. German intelligence was aware of major leaks. Prominent Danish collaborators had been assassinated. Sabotage was becoming a major issue for the Wehrmacht, and the Gestapo was run off its feet trying to deal with the resistance. The Germans declared martial law on August 29th, taking governance into their own hands. German police appeared on the streets and remained there until the eventual Allied liberation in 1945. Flame and Lemon could no longer operate with impunity. From then on, they were constantly hunted. On September 9th, 1944, the Lemon was carrying out another hit with fellow resistance fighter Helmer Bomhoff. Disguised as policemen and driving a stolen police car, the pair drove through central Copenhagen towards St. Hans Square. By sheer misfortune, they donned their disguises the same day the Gestapo decided to arrest Copenhagen's entire Danish police force. The car was stopped at a German roadblock, and the men were ordered out while the vehicle was searched. Both immediately knew the game was up, as they had a briefcase inside the car containing pistols and an incriminatingly large number of grenades. A whisper passed between the 2 men. Then the Lemon made a break for it. He jumped onto some nearby bins and tried to shimmy up a wall, but was shot in the back by a Danish Nazi. In the confusion, his comrade Bomhoff simply walked away. By chance, a resistance member working for the Copenhagen ambulance service witnessed the escape attempt and called for an ambulance. It arrived quickly, and the wounded Lemon was loaded into the back. An armed guard got in too. However, the ambulance crew were also resistance members, and recognizing one of their own helped fabricate yet another distraction. Informing the guard that the Lemon was about to die, they pulled over to fetch water. The Lemon then drew a pistol hidden in his boot and shot the distracted guard several times through the head, killing him. The Lemon was later taken to a safe house and cared for by a resistance nurse. He was bedridden for over a month, but his ordeal wasn't over yet. On October 14th, German secret police came to the safe house to arrest its owner. Hearing their shouts from outside, the Lemon believed he had been betrayed. Still injured and unable to run, he decided to go down fighting. Hidden in the house was the Flames' personal stash with enough weapons and ammunition to arm an entire fire team. The Lemon greeted his Gestapo guests by emptying a pistol magazine through the door, killing one of them. He then relocated to a dressing room with an unrestricted field of fire. Germans burst into the house, but were immediately repulsed by automatic fire. They pulled back, and an eyewitness saw a small group of wounded men hobbling out together before a grenade flew through a window and blew them to pieces. Outmatched, the Gestapo called in the Wehrmacht to force the Lemon out. 200 soldiers from the Jägersborg barracks surrounded the house and subjected it to constant small arms fire. They set fires around the house and punched through the walls with high caliber weapons, but every time they tried to force an entry, they came right back out, dragging casualties. The Lemon held out for more than 3 hours before the flames began to consume the building. With no alternative, the crazed Dane charged through the door while spitting automatic fire from a Sten gun. German rounds tore into him, and the Lemon fell. Not long after the Lemon's last stand, Gestapo agents located the Flames' hideout. Moments before they could reach him, however, he swallowed a cyanide pill and died. The Flame and the Lemon gave up no secrets. During the siege, the Lemon killed 11 soldiers and wounded another 4. While wounded, he held his position in the house longer than the entire Royal Danish Army had held back the initial German invasion. That was the story of the Lemon, the Flame, and of the Danish Resistance during the Second World War.
For the unfortunate Jews living in Nazi Germany and its occupation zones, life during the war was scarcely bearable. As the Nazi plans for the Holocaust, the final eradication of Jews and Jewish culture from Europe, were put into action, a few brave souls made a stand. From the forests, the ghettos, and the hellish extermination camps, Jews fought back against those who sought to destroy them. In this video, we tell their stories. When the Germans took over Poland in 1939, one of their priorities was to set up the now infamous Jewish ghettos. The primary function of these ghettos was to restrict the movement of Jewish people to a certain area. By 1940, most ghettos were fully enclosed with brick walls and barbed wire. Patrolling German police and soldiers were ordered to shoot anyone attempting to leave or enter the ghetto. The largest ghetto was located in the Polish capital of Warsaw. This immense inner-city prison camp covered 3.4 square kilometers and housed 460,000 Jewish prisoners at its peak. However, these numbers soon began to dwindle. In 1941, the daily food ration for each person living in the ghetto was cut to just 184 calories, less than 1% of what the average person needs. This spawned a lucrative black market. First, it was just food being smuggled into the ghetto, but it wasn't long before weapons started coming in too. These were carefully stockpiled by the Jewish Combat Organization and Jewish Military Union known as the ZOB and ZZW. In the summer of 1942, the deportations began. Without warning, German soldiers entered the ghettos to round up people for what they said was resettlement in the east. In reality, they were being sent to extermination camps. The largest of these deportations was scheduled for January 1943, but this time, the resistance was prepared. On January 18th, SS troops and German police stormed into the Warsaw ghetto. They shot 600 people and then began rounding up another 5,000. Then, seemingly from nowhere, the resistance appeared. Men and women of the ZOB and ZZW threw a barrage of Molotov cocktails at their oppressors, then opened fire with pistols at close range. The Germans were decimated and rapidly forced out of the ghetto. Expecting a counterattack, the resistance fighters set up fortifications. They held out until April, beating back several German attacks and forcing the resignation of the German commander. But on the 19th, 2,000 SS troops launched a massive frontal assault. The resistance was well prepared, but couldn't hope to withstand such numbers. They went down fighting, forcing the SS to capture the ghetto block by block. Afterwards, the Germans liquidated the site, killing and deporting an estimated 56,065 people. But their last stand hadn't been in vain. Their sacrifice inspired uprisings in 100 different ghettos across eastern Poland. For those who managed to escape starvation and deportation in the ghettos, there were other ways to fight back against the Nazis. Many Jews joined partisan units operating from forests across Europe. Jewish partisans were active in Poland, France, Belgium, the Soviet Union, the Baltic, and Yugoslavia. Some groups, such as the famous Bielski Partisans of Poland, looked after Jewish civilians. Others, like the Belarusian Chokalov Brigade, only accepted armed fighters with some combat experience. Outside Lithuania and Yugoslavia, there was no cohesive partisan central command. Each group had its own objectives and set its own rules. Some groups stole food, clothing, and supplies from civilians at gunpoint, while others tried to establish civilian communes. Communist partisan groups operating in the occupied Soviet Union were occasionally supplied directly by the Red Army and given military orders, but most didn't receive this level of support. They relied on the individual skills of their members and supplies looted from the enemy. It's estimated that between 20,000 and 30,000 Jews served as partisans during the Second World War. 4,500 of these were from Yugoslavia alone, where they helped to liberate the country from Axis rule. A further 3,000 Jewish partisans fought on the front lines. Over 1/3 were killed in action, and 10 were awarded Yugoslavia's highest honor, the Order of the People's Hero. Even though they were often beaten, starved, and worked to near death, some of the extermination camp prisoners found the strength to fight back. There were many small acts of sabotage, especially in camps where prisoners were forced to manufacture war materials. In some camps, Jewish prisoners banded together to launch full-scale revolts. At the Treblinka extermination camp in August 1943, 2 young men managed to steal the armory key from a guard. Using scrap, they successfully copied the key and replaced the original. The Nazis were none the wiser. The men then sneaked into the armory and stole grenades, ammunition, and weapons, which they distributed to the other inmates. Halfway through this heist, a guard caught another prisoner with stolen money and took him for interrogation. He knew about the plot, and the Jewish ringleaders feared he would spill the beans under torture, so they launched their attack early. They set off a grenade, the signal for the revolt to begin, then attacked the guards with whatever firearms or improvised weapons they could get their hands on. At first, the Nazis were taken by surprise, and the Jewish prisoners managed to kill several, torch their vehicles, burn down their barracks, and destroy fuel supplies. But it wasn't enough. The guards counterattacked with machine guns and killed 1,500 prisoners. Their sacrifice wasn't in vain though, as the camp's gas chambers were made inoperable and, allegedly, the camp was closed due to damage from the revolt. On the flip side of the guns blazing approach was the revolt at Sobibor extermination camp. At this Polish camp in October 1943, the prisoners chose stealth. The revolt was led by Alexander Pekerski, a Jewish Red Army soldier. He was one of the first POWs to be sent to the camp, which otherwise held civilians. On his 3rd day, Pekerski openly defied an SS officer by rejecting cigarettes and bread intended to win him over. This won him the support of the Polish prisoner leadership. A few days later, Pekerski was ordered to sort through the clothing belonging to murdered prisoners from other camps. In a pocket, he found a note from one of these condemned men. It read, "I don't know where they're taking us now. They say to Germany. If all this is a lie, then know that death awaits you too. Do not trust the Germans. Avenge our blood. Knowing what awaited him and the others, Bucurski decided to act. He got a small team together comprising of only the most die-hard anti-Nazis in the camp. Each was assigned a specific SS officer whose routine they memorized. The conspirators then waited for the commandant to leave with some of the auxiliary Ukrainian guards. The revolt kicked off on October 14th, when several of Bucurski's conspirators lured their targets into a warehouse under the guise of presenting them with luxury goods found in the luggage of gassed prisoners. The officers were then brutally hacked to death with axes, chisels, and improvised knives. They then broke into the guards' living quarters and stole some weapons left lying around. Everything went according to plan until a particularly sadistic officer who had left earlier returned unexpectedly. Without knowing a revolt was happening, he shot several prisoners, as he customarily did to instill fear. Bucurski's crew thought the game was up, and so they let loose with everything they had. Yelling, "Hurrah, the revolt has begun," 420 Jewish prisoners stormed the gates. They broke through and fled into the surrounding forest. 80 were killed by fire from the watchtowers and in perimeter minefields. A further 170 were recaptured and executed on Himmler's orders, but 200 made it out alive, including Bucurski. A soldier through and through, Bucurski gathered weapons and a few loyal men before marching toward the front line. Still wearing his original Red Army uniform, he joined a Soviet-backed partisan group and fought as a demolitions expert. He later tried to rejoin the Red Army, but was thrown into a penal unit for the crime of surrendering before he was initially captured. This didn't diminish Bucurski's spirit though, as he earned his way out and into a regular unit by heroism and a near fatal wound. He survived the war as a captain and, at the Nuremberg trials, testified against the SS officers his crew hadn't managed to kill. Not everyone has the courage and fighting spirit of Captain Bucurski, and examples like his were fairly rare. For the vast majority of the European Jewish population, survival itself was the most important form of resistance. The Nazis wanted to eradicate Jewish people and culture from Europe, and the best way to stop that happening was for the Jewish people to simply survive. With the odds so stacked against them, it's genuinely amazing what some managed to accomplish. For most Europeans, the end of the Second World War meant the fighting was done and the process of rebuilding could begin. But for the resistance fighters of Lithuania, the struggle was far from over. This motley band of partisans, Marxists, Nazis, liberals, and renegades stayed in the fight until 1953. In this video, we shed some light on those disparate factions and pose the question, how on earth did they manage to get along? Lithuania has a long and bloody history of resistance and guerrilla warfare. From its declaration of independence in February 1918 to the start of the Second World War in 1939, Lithuania fought 3 separate wars, one against the Bolsheviks, one against a force of Baltic Germans pretending to be White Russians, and another against Poland. While the conventional armies battled it out, Lithuanian guerrillas and urban resistance fighters conducted recon and raided enemy supply lines. It was during these early struggles that Lithuanian soldiers and resistance members gained the crucial skills and experience they would soon need for the Lithuanian army. Lithuania would have liked to remain neutral during the Second World War, but its position smack bang in between the Soviet Union and Germany made this impossible. When Soviet and German diplomats carved up Eastern Europe between them, Lithuania was lumped in the Soviet pile. The Reds consolidated by annexing the country in June 1940. At this point, the people of Lithuania had had a 2-decade-long taste of independence, and they weren't about to let it slip away into the hands of the Soviets. Their response was the Lithuanian Activist Front, or LAF, an incredibly diverse resistance movement that included Nationalist Party members, pro-Nazis, and trade unionists. The LAF built a secret communications network and spied on the Soviets, but they also carried out scattered armed raids. Buying into the whole enemy of my enemy thing, the LAF provided intel to the Germans and in return received warning of Operation Barbarossa. Seizing the German invasion of the East on June 22nd, 1941 as a perfect cover, the LAF launched what became known as the June Uprising on the same day. Around 10,000 resistance fighters from around the country rose up and attacked the Soviets, fighting side by side with the Wehrmacht. The LAF greeted the Germans as liberators, but instead of freeing Lithuania, Hitler amalgamated it into German Ostland. The LAF had been betrayed. Fearing an anti-German uprising, the German invaders clamped down hard on the LAF. The front's leader, Leonas Prapolianus, was arrested along with many others and sent to Dachau to rot. This betrayal was made all the worse by the fact that the LAF had issued a manifesto aligning it politically to Nazi Germany. This manifesto was viciously anti-Semitic, stating the Lithuanian Activist Front, by restoring the new Lithuania, is determined to carry out an immediate and fundamental purging of the Lithuanian nation and its land of Jews. The only advantage the LAF had in the face of the overwhelming German opposition was its scattered units throughout the country. Knowing they couldn't face the might of the Wehrmacht head-on, the resistance members melted into the forests. By late 1941, the LAF was no more, but its members were still resisting the occupation out of the forests. Trade unionists, anti-Semites, nationalists, and liberals were stockpiling weapons and preparing for a guerrilla campaign against the Germans. But wait, it's about to get a lot more complicated. Immediately after they retreated from Lithuania, the Red Army deployed several communist partisan units to the forests. These pro-Soviet Lithuanians received supplies from partisan command in Moscow in return for causing as much chaos as they could for the Germans. Surprising no one, they set up their bases in the forest too. While all this was going on, the Germans were putting their Jewish extermination plan into action. The Lithuanian Jews weren't too happy about this and, would you believe it, started another resistance movement and called it the United Partisan Organization, or FPO. Formed in January 1942 in the Vilna Ghetto, FPO's primary goal was to arm as many Jews as possible and sabotage the German war machine. They brought together Jewish factions from right across the political compass, including Marxist-Leninists, socialists, right-wing Zionists, and Jewish ethno-nationalists. It didn't take long for the Nazis to notice the Jews were suddenly way better armed and organized, and they did their best to crush the organization. When they came to liquidate the ghetto in 1943, some FPO members stayed to fight, while most fled to the forests. In mid-1943, Lithuania's forests were absolutely teeming with resistance groups. The country was still under German occupation, but the Wehrmacht had been dealt a mortal blow at Stalingrad and were in full retreat. Sensing an opportunity, the myriad resistance groups in the forest met up and consolidated themselves into the Supreme Committee of the Liberation of Lithuania, or WWII. The Supreme Committee included nearly everyone from hardcore Marxist-Leninists who thought the Soviet Union wasn't communist enough, to liberals and nationalists who were veterans of the LAF and the Lithuanian army before the war, to far-right Zionists and ardent anti-Semites snubbed by the Nazis. Reportedly, it was very difficult to make decisions. With that many different ideologies in the mix, it's amazing they got anything done at all. One thing they did do was prepare. WWII decided that the main enemy of Lithuania wasn't the occupying Germans, but the advancing Soviets. Choosing to play the long game, the WWII resistance fighters did their best to capture as much German equipment as they could and stockpile it. They knew the Germans couldn't hold back the oncoming Soviet tsunami, and when they came, WWII would be ready to defend Lithuania. Between July and October 1944, the Soviets reasserted their control over Lithuania. Ready for a fight, the Lithuanian Liberation Army, LLA, declared war against the Soviet Union on July 1st and threw all their military might into harrying the Red advance. The LLA was well drilled, disciplined, and even wore standardized uniforms. According to NKVD statistics, the LLA had 10,000 fighters, but the real number is probably much smaller. They used both captured German and Soviet weapons along with smuggled Czech guns. Command was centralized under Lithuanian army officer Kazis Veverskis, who ran the resistance campaign from his forest headquarters. The LLA fought hard against the Soviets, killing around 4,000 NKVD and Red Army soldiers in 1944 and 1945, but their centralized command was an Achilles heel. In December 1945, the NKVD located Veverskis' headquarters and killed off the commanders. The head of the snake was gone, but the LLA simply dissolved into other resistance groups. The Reds would have to do much better than that to crush the Lithuanians. These remnants became known as the Forest Brothers and kept fighting the Soviets even after the war had ended. Political discussions between the Forest Brothers were probably pretty fierce, seeing as the organization included Nazi Party members and ex-Wehrmacht troops, Jewish ethno-nationalists and Zionists, Marxist-Leninists and socialists, and liberals and conservatives from the old regime. Thought it couldn't get any more complicated? Well, the USSR's anti-religion stance put them onto the bad side of many Catholics who joined up too. It's estimated that around 30,000 people fought with the Forest Brothers, and amazingly, they managed to get along just fine. Such is the power of anti-Soviet hatred. With a combination of fighting skill, organization, preparation, and guerrilla experience, the Forest Brothers kept fighting a large-scale insurgent war until the 1950s. Deep knowledge of the land let the Forest Brothers launch deadly strikes against Soviet bases and lay expert ambushes for the NKVD and Red Army units sent to eradicate them. They were so effective that, by 1949, they controlled large sections of the countryside and nearly all of the forests. The Soviets knew that sending in troops was a suicide mission, so instead, they went after the men's families. Soviet officials used mass deportations, imprisonment, and covert surveillance to bring the Forest Brothers down. The large-scale resistance ended in 1953, with many Forest Brothers giving up the fight when Stalin died. One of the last Forest Brothers, Benediktas Mikulis, was caught in 1971, 32 years after the resistance to the Soviet occupation began. In September 1939, World War II exploded across Europe. In a matter of months, the war spread to multiple countries across the continent and soon, the globe. There was a lot at stake, and nations across Europe hastened to pick up a metaphorical side or do whatever they could to remain neutral. Despite the quick onset of war, it didn't spread evenly. The Axis powers had a plan, and eventually, that plan came to Greece. On October 28, 1940, Italian dictator Benito Mussolini demanded that Greece surrender to the Axis powers. The Greek Prime Minister, Ioannis Metaxas, responded with a declarative no, thus heralding the start of the Greco-Italian War and beginning the Axis powers' Balkans campaign. The Italians attempted to invade Greece from Albania, which was their protectorate at the time. Against all odds, the Greeks managed to repel the initial Italian invasion with the help of the British, then pushed into the Italian protectorate and occupied its southern territories. However, the Greek successes came to a halt on April 6, 1941, when the Germans finally pushed down through Bulgaria. The Battle of Greece, as it came to be known, or Operation Marita, saw a resounding victory for the German forces. It took them 4 days to take Thessaloniki, the second largest city in Greece, and on April 27th, the Germans entered the capital city of Athens and raised the Nazi flag above the Acropolis. Greece surrendered, and the Axis occupation of the country began. Despite their crushing defeat at the hands of the Germans, the Greeks did not take their defeat lying down. Over the next 4 years, they were crushed under an incredibly brutal occupier's heel, but it didn't break their spirit. Fronts of resistance assembled to take the fight to their occupiers, fighting for Greece's freedom. At the same time, Greek civilians risked their lives and families to aid the guerrilla fighters and allied forces. Despite their limited resources and brutal anti-resistance measures, the Greeks fought on to an extent that drew the admiration of great powers across Europe. Today, we'll be telling their story. Between April 1941 and October 1944, Greece was occupied by the Axis powers. The country was divided between the three occupying forces: Germans, Bulgarians, and Italians. Following the country's total occupation in April of 1941, the Axis powers appointed a new government staffed by their collaborators. Although it's impossible to quantify brutality, contemporary sources stated the Italians were the most lenient occupiers. The Bulgarians were particularly vicious in their occupation of northern Greece due to their interest in the territories bordering Bulgaria. The Germans, on the other hand, were clinically and efficiently brutal. During the Axis occupation of Greece, Greece suffered the greatest loss of life and the most destruction out of any non-Slavic country in Europe. A conservative estimate puts the country's total losses at 50,000 people who lost their lives as resistance fighters or because of German retaliation, 50 to 60,000 Jews who were displaced to concentration camps, tens of thousands of civilians who died of starvation. Out of a population of 7 million, Greece lost an estimated total of 300,000. In total, 800 villages and towns were razed to the ground. Under German occupation, restrictions were immediately placed on civilians. Among other suppression measures, the Germans imposed a nighttime curfew on all citizens. Heavy censorship laws were established. Anyone suspected of anti-German activity was arrested, then tortured or executed. In many cities, such as Thessaloniki, Ioannina, and Corfu, where a significant Jewish presence had prospered, the Jews were systematically rounded up and transported to concentration camps. One of the Germans' first priorities was plundering the country's resources. Greece's national treasury was emptied out, but the Germans didn't stop at gold. They systematically looted livestock and agricultural resources, particularly food. The famine that resulted from these seizures led to extreme food shortages across the country. In the urban centers, where people were unable to forage scraps off the land, tens of thousands of people starved to death or fled to the countryside. During the winter of 1941 to 1942, it's estimated that 300 people died daily in Athens from starvation alone. 90-year-old Logothetis, a child at the time, remembered what it was like in occupied Athens when we interviewed him about his lived experiences. We lived in Athens back then. When things got too difficult, we left for the village where we could live off the land. It wasn't much. A goat, some weeds from wherever they could find. My aunt brought back large plants, juicy and tasty. When they asked her where she'd found them, she admitted she'd picked them in the cemetery where the soil was fertile. There are many testimonies of what people would eat during this time to avoid starvation. Flour and water was one common dish. Another was stealing food scraps from the trash the occupiers threw out, such as fruit peels. One reason the Italians were considered more merciful than the Germans is because they would directly give children food scraps, unlike the Germans, who destroyed any food waste so the locals could have nothing. For the purpose of this video, we were able to interview 89-year-old Alexandra Margu, who lived in the town of Soufli to the northeast of Greece during the occupation. Although her town was far from the large urban centers, she recalls many harsh measures the Germans imposed. At nights, we had to black out the windows so no lights could shine through. We hung heavy curtains in the windows and kept to one room. They were afraid of air raids. One night, my mother forgot to block a window out and the Germans came to our house. They took my father's ID as punishment and told him to retrieve it the next day and to bring them 30 eggs. The Germans were the most brutal, however, when it came to retaliating against local resistance group activity. When asked, Alexandra remembers how the Germans dealt with the threat of resistance. They rounded up anyone they thought was connected to the resistance and held them in a jail near the town square. They held entire families, sometimes including the children. One time, the partisans killed one Nazi. In retaliation, the Germans brought 8 civilians out and executed them publicly in the town square. "One of us for 8 of you," they said. The partisans didn't kill another German for the entire occupation. This, of course, wasn't the only incident of German retaliation. Throughout the occupation, the Germans used the threat of retaliation against civilians as a way to dissuade the resistance from their activities. Entire communities were razed to the ground, their population executed and their buildings burnt to a cinder. In total, over 800 communities were wiped off the map. These burnings are known as holocausts in Greek, a word meaning completely burnt away. We'll still be using the word to refer to these events, but they shouldn't be confused with the Holocaust of the Jews, which is entirely unrelated. There are too many communities to list, but we'll mention some of the most tragic incidents of German retaliation. On October 25th, 1941, the Germans destroyed the villages of Klisto, Ambelofito, and Kedonia in one day in retaliation for partisan victories in the area. On May 31st, 1944, 40 civilians were publicly hanged in a small village called Orman Margula. This execution was retaliation for the actions of the Greek Liberation Army, who had sabotaged the Volos-Kalambaka train and caused it to explode, killing 4 Germans. The most brutal incident, however, was the Holocaust of Kalavrita, widely recognized as the worst war crime in Greek history. Operation Kalavrita began on December 4th, 1943, as a mass retaliation for the deaths of 77 German soldiers who'd been imprisoned by the partisans. The Nazis aimed to terrorize the locals and dissuade the partisans from further action. Throughout the operation, they burnt over 1,000 homes to the ground in over 50 villages. As they moved through the countryside, the Nazis looted anything valuable such as livestock and food stores to ensure the survivors would starve to death. In total, 677 unarmed civilians were executed, 499 of whom were in Kalavrita, the final target of the operation. On December 9th, Wehrmacht forces occupied the town and set its homes ablaze. On December 13th, the town's population was gathered in front of the town school where the women, children, and the elderly were separated from the men and boarded up in the building. The men were marched to a hill overlooking the burning village locally known as the Kapi's Back. The hill's amphitheatrical layout meant any who tried to escape could be gunned down. There, nearly 500 men were executed by rapid gunfire while they watched their homes burn. The women and children, meanwhile, watched as their townsmen were executed, all while the flames licked ever closer. Thankfully, they managed to escape the school and fled before the flames reached it. Despite the merciless retaliation by the Germans, the Greeks didn't go quietly into that good night. On the contrary, Greek resistance kept rising throughout the occupation, with valiant efforts made not only by the resistance fighters themselves, but also unarmed civilians. As one nation, Greece rose to the challenge of reclaiming their freedom, and everyone did their part. From the beginning, the Greek people revolted against their German occupiers, sometimes as individuals, but most often as collective movements. On May 30th, 1941, barely a month after the Nazi flag had been raised on the Acropolis, 2 youths, Manolis Glezos and Lakis Santas, snuck onto the ancient monument and tore down the Nazi swastika, raising the Greek flag to wave once more above the capital. Although short-lived, this act of blatant defiance was incredibly symbolic for the resisting Greeks. On another front, a unit of PUFY, the Pan-Hellenic Union of Fighting Youths, bombed the headquarters of the National Socialist Patriotic Organization, a local organization of Nazi collaborators. When the order came for the Jews to be gathered and deported to the concentration camps, everyday Greeks rose to the occasion and took young Jewish children into their homes, hiding them from the Germans, despite knowing that, were they to be caught harboring a Jew, they would face the firing squad. As a community, the Greeks rose together to form the resistance. It wasn't something the men did alone. Women, the elderly, and particularly the youths were involved in fighting back against the Nazi regime. By the autumn of 1941, organized resistance movements had formed. The most influential one was the National Liberation Front, known as EAM in Greek. Formed by the Communist Party of Greece, or the KKE, in collaboration with smaller left-wing parties, the EAM spearheaded the resistance. In February of 1942, they established the Greek People's Liberation Army, or ELAS, which was their military branch. What EAM fought for was liberating Greece from its foreign occupiers and guaranteeing the right of the Greek people to determine their post-war government. From a more right-wing political party came the Greek National Democratic Union, or EDES, which was a smaller resistance movement. EAM partisans took to guerrilla warfare across the country as a way of facing down the better-equipped Germans. Hiding in the mountains, partisans raided German outposts or convoys, sabotaged critical supply lines, and executed Axis soldiers whenever they could. Thanks to their mobility, it was impossible for the occupying forces to pin them down. To dissuade the partisans from their guerrilla tactics, the Nazis retaliated heavily against civilians and formed security brigades to terrorize the locals. On multiple occasions, ELAS and EDES forces cooperated with Allied forces to sabotage the Germans. On November 25, 1942, Operation Harling saw the demolition of Gogopotamos Bridge by a team of ELAS, EDES, and British Special Operations Executive Forces. This was the first major Axis sabotage in Europe. Thanks to Operation Harling, German supply lines supporting their troops in Africa were disrupted, and the Germans could no longer resupply through Greece. The British-Greek cooperation was best seen on the island of Crete. As the German armies invaded Greece in April of 1941, all remaining Commonwealth soldiers were forced to evacuate the country. In May of 1941, Wehrmacht paratroopers descended on the island in what would come to be known as the Battle of Crete. They weren't prepared for the ferocious local resistance, which saw civilians attacking and killing several German parachuters with knives, axes, scythes, or even barehanded. Although the Germans succeeded in securing the island, it was at a heavy cost. Following the German occupation of the island, many British SOE forces were stranded, unable to evacuate. The locals immediately rose to the occasion, establishing communication with Egypt by boat and evacuating many British and Dominion soldiers. Those that chose to remain or were unable to evacuate found refuge in the local Greeks' homes, who took them in and hid them from the Germans. SOE and RAF forces teamed up with the Cretan resistance, who in time adopted the mantle of the mainland's EAM to sabotage German assets on the island, as Crete was being used by the Axis powers to resupply their forces in Africa. Together, the British and Cretans struck many successful blows to the Axis powers, such as by destroying the Castelli and Heraklion airfields and abducting General Heinrich Kreipe. Sir Patrick Leigh Fermor, a British SOE officer stationed on Crete, had this to say of the Cretans' resilience. When the Germans invaded Crete, their armies had just defeated the whole of Europe. Logically, the civilian population could have been expected to remain inactive while the professionals, the British Commonwealth, and a small number of Greek troops fought it out with the invaders. But to the great astonishment of both sides, all over the island, bodies of Cretans, villagers, shepherds, old men, boys, monks, and priests, and even women, without any collusion between them or master plan or arms or guidance from the official combatants, rose up at once and threw themselves on the invaders. The British forces found themselves as scattered, isolated cells across the island's mountains. Their means of communication were local runners who would unerringly deliver intel from cell to cell. Sir Patrick Leigh Fermor said about his cell's runner, Psikundakis was a great favourite of everyone's, for his humour, high spirits, pluck and imagination, and above all, the tireless zest with which he threw himself into the task. If anybody could put a girdle round Crete in 40 minutes, he could. Crete wasn't the only place civilians directly involved themselves in supporting the resistance and its fighters. Urban centres took collective action to defy their occupiers. In April of 1942, telecommunications workers went on one of occupied Europe's first strikes. In January of 1943, they succeeded in blocking the Germans from sending Greeks to forced labor camps in Germany. The funeral procession of Kostis Palamas, national poet of Greece, was also an act of open defiance as thousands took to the streets against Nazi suppression measures. In the countryside, towns and villages smuggled supplies and intel to the guerrilla fighters active in their areas. Alexandra Margul recalled her experiences of her family and neighbors supporting the partisans, saying, "We were 3 houses built together, us, the baker, and the electrician. Back then, we didn't have electricity meters. We paid per light bulb. Whenever needed, my mother put us girls to bed early and the electrician snuck in to unscrew our light bulb. He would then plug in a huge battery so it would charge until 11 PM when the electricity was shut off. The partisans needed these for their wireless radios. It took 2 nights to charge the batteries. During the day, they would hide it in a hole covered with mulberry leaves, and when they were charged, my neighbor hid 2 baskets filled with manure and took them to his vineyard on the mountainside. The partisans collected them from there. Once, when they needed to charge the batteries as an emergency, they hosted a party in the bakery. The Germans would always come to feast and drink with the locals. That night, they hosted the Germans on the top floor of the bakery while, in the basement, they secretly charged the batteries. The Germans ordered the electricity to not be shut off so they could drink more, and so they charged them in 1 night instead of 2. She also recounted how they hid the partisans in their own homes. "We had large sallies in our homes where we raised our silkworms. In our house, we hosted EAM meetings at night. In our neighbor's house, the partisans would hide when they came in from the mountain." For 4 years, the Greek people, guerrilla fighters, and civilians alike fought tenaciously against the Germans, and their bravery and courage in the face of the Axis invasion and occupation drew the admiration of political leaders around the world. Winston Churchill praised their courage in a statement he made at the House of Commons on April 24, 1941. "The word heroism, I'm afraid, does not render the least of those acts of self-sacrifice of the Greeks, which were the defining factor in the victorious outcome of the common struggle of the nations during World War II for the human freedom and dignity. If it were not for the bravery of Greeks and their courage, the outcome of World War II would be undetermined." A few months after the German invasion, Franklin Roosevelt also shared his thoughts on their tenacity. The heroic struggle of the Greek people to defend their liberties and their homes against the aggression of Germany after they had so signally defeated the Italian attempt at invasion has stirred the hearts and aroused the sympathy of the whole American people. Finally, in January of 1943, Joseph Stalin made a statement after the victory at the Battle of Stalingrad. He was quoted saying, "I'm sorry because I'm getting old and I shall not live long to thank the Greek people whose resistance decided World War II." The June 6, 1944 Normandy landings heralded the end of the Axis powers. With the Red Army's march toward Germany and the upheaval in Romania, Nazi Germany was forced to pull its forces out of Greece. The EAM had already liberated a huge percentage of the mainland's territory and had set up a national government in exile known as the Government of the Mountain. On October 12, 1944, the German occupying force left Athens. 2 days later, the British arrived in the city and were welcomed with enthusiasm. 4 days after that, the government in exile arrived in the capital. Greece was finally free, and the difficult act of rebuilding had to begin. It turned out to be more difficult than anyone had imagined. More than half a century later, damage dealt by the Axis occupiers is still felt today in modern Greece. Hundreds of thousands had lost their lives, almost 1,000 towns and villages had been utterly destroyed, and the resources the country had gathered after World War I had been looted. The road of recovery for Greece was hard, and the intense political division left behind by World War II led not to a unified country, but to a bitter civil war that saw war heroes executed as enemies of the state. But for those years of struggle against the Axis powers, the Greeks fought together, and they fought like heroes. So that's how a small, underdog country managed to win the respect of some of the most war-hardened politicians of the 20th century. Had you ever heard of Greece's valiant resistance against the Axis powers? Would you be interested in a deeper dive into how Greece managed to repel the Italian invaders and force Nazi Germany to intervene? From the raids of the long-range desert group to the expedition of Merrill's marauders, the Second World War played host to some of the most audacious special forces operations to have ever been carried out. But one operation trumps them all. In this video, we tell the story of how two British officers kidnapped a German general from inside of his own fortress. The fortress we're talking about is the island of Crete, located about halfway between the Greek mainland and Egypt. The island had been in Axis hands since May 1941, when elite German mountain and parachute troops, supported by some Italians, emerged victorious from the brutal Battle of Crete. As soon as the Allies were gone, the Germans started turning Crete into a fortress. Bunkers and pillboxes were installed along the island's southern shore in preparation for the expected invasion from Egypt. Below the surface, Crete's natural caves were used to store munitions and as bomb shelters during air raids. In 1943, Crete was home to a German garrison of 75,000 soldiers, including a Luftwaffe airbase. Even the local Cretans were roped in, with forced labourers building barracks for the soldiers and prison camps for Allied POWs. The Cretans really weren't happy about having to contribute to the German war effort. A hardy people famed for their dogged resistance to the Ottomans decades earlier, the civilians of Crete hated being pushed around and did all they could to slow the invaders down. Enter Billy Moss and Paddy Lee Fermor, two officers of Britain's Special Operations Executive. Chances are you've heard of SOE before, as this was the unit that orchestrated Britain's most daring operations and craziest pranks. Moss and Fermor fit right in among the eclectic mix of officers at SOE, partly due to their own zany backstories. Described as a dangerous mix of sophistication and recklessness, Fermor was a chap that just couldn't be put off by anything. He spent a few years before the war walking from Holland to Istanbul, then travelled extensively around Greece, Macedonia and Romania. He picked up the local language and culture wherever he went, becoming a master of blending in. Like Fermor, Moss was a polyglot and had also crossed a good deal of Europe on foot. When the war began, he was living in a log cabin on the Latvian coast. Probably having an inkling as to how well the Baltic states would fare squeezed between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, Moss managed to get himself to Norway, where he casually jumped on a yacht and sailed to England. Both men saw their share of combat during the early years of the war and both volunteered for service with SOE in 1943. They were assigned to Task Force 133, a special unit that helped coordinate resistance groups and generally cause the Axis as much trouble as possible. Over a few drinks one night at the Royal Hunting and Fishing Club in Cairo, Fermor and Moss hatched a daring plan. They were going to kidnap a general. One of the units guarding Crete was the German 22nd Air Landing Division, and its commander was infamous. His name was General Müller, but for his harsh reprisals against the local people, he was better known as the Butcher of Crete. The plan was to kidnap Müller and transport him to Egypt, thus boosting Cretan morale and flipping off the Germans all in one go. The head honcho at SOE Cairo thought their plan was nuts, but signed off on it anyway. He couldn't let two of his best chaps go it alone, so he ordered Cretan resistance fighters, Georgios Taurakis and Emmanuel Patarakis, to join them. After some training in Palestine, the team was ready to go by January 1944. Like all good spec ops, the lads were going to parachute in at night, but things didn't go to plan. Their first flight to Crete on February 5th was turned around due to bad weather, but not before the intrepid Fermor jumped out of the plane. He landed safely and was picked up by the Cretan resistance, who hid him in a cave. The rest of the team tried to parachute in 7 more times, but bad weather continually aborted the mission. Realizing their plane was probably jinxed, the crew landed on Crete from a small boat under the cover of night. They met up with Fermor at the cave on April 4th, 2 months after he parachuted in. Whilst the others were delayed by the weather, Fermor had been busy. Using his vast knowledge of Cretan language and customs, he successfully disguised himself as a shepherd, built an intelligence network, and kept tabs on German movements. When Moss and the crew turned up, he had some bad news. General Müller had been moved elsewhere and replaced by General Kreipe, who wasn't nearly as evil. But the Brits had come for a general, and they'd be damned if they went home without one. General Kreipe would have to do. Teaming up with the surprisingly well-equipped Cretan resistance, Fermor and Moss travelled to the village of Knossos, which overlooked the general's residence. The initial plan was to assault the house and take Kreipe by surprise, but some recon showed it was far too well defended. Plan B involved carjacking Kreipe while he went to his regularly scheduled divisional meeting. The route required the general's car to navigate a poor quality section of road before a T-junction, which would slow it to a walking pace for a few minutes. The German military police, called the Feldgendarmerie, had frequent inspection points along the road, giving the infiltrators a perfect cover to approach the car. While Fermor and Moss were lying low in their hideout, the resistance got the ball rolling. They tracked all of Kreipe's movements and learned his schedule. One steely-eyed fighter called Acumanicus managed to acquire 2 full Feldgendarmerie uniforms, complete with sidearms, campaign badges, and a traffic directing stick. The Brits were too polite to ask where he'd got them. Everything was ready to go for the night of April 26. Fermor and Moss were standing in the road in their acquired uniforms, and a squad of resistance fighters were hiding in the trees, ready to open up with their rifles if anything went wrong. As the car approached, Moss waved his stick, and Fermor shouted "Halt!" in perfect German. The car stopped, and he went to the window to ask for Kreipe's papers. None the wiser, Kreipe looked down to fetch them. When he looked up, Fermor had a gun pointed right at him. Kreipe's driver noticed something was wrong, but before he could act, Moss swooped in and knocked him unconscious with his stick. After tying the Germans up and throwing them in the back, Moss jumped into the driver's seat and Fermor impersonated Kreipe. 3 fighters also jumped into the car as backup. Hitting the gas, Moss drove through 22 German roadblocks on the route to the town of Rethimo. Kreipe was famous among his men for being extremely impatient at roadblocks and refusing to stop. When the real Feldgendarmes saw his car coming on the night of his kidnapping, they were more than happy to let him straight through. Believe it or not, the kidnapping was the easy part. The real struggle was getting out of Crete with an angry general in tow. Knowing the value of the high ground, Fermor and Moss decided to drag Kreipe up to the highest mountain in Crete, Mount Ida. To say the Germans were unhappy their general went missing would be a severe understatement, and they sent them no less than 30,000 troops to get him back. With the Germans on their heels, Fermor, Moss, Kreipe and their Cretan guides climbed over Mount Ida and on May 2nd reached the town of Aya Pereskevi in the Amuri Valley on the other side. They desperately needed to get a radio message to SOE headquarters to organize their extraction, but the Germans were on a rampage, destroying any villages with connections to the resistance. The kidnappers and their entourage of Cretan fighters managed to stay a step ahead of the Germans by hopping from village to village right across the Amuri Valley. Eventually, they managed to locate an SOE radio, succeeding in contacting headquarters on May 5th. On May 14th, after passing through another 6 villages and avoiding a 200-strong German column, the original 4-man team, plus General Kreipe and 3 POWs captured by the Cretans, boarded a special boat service transport. By May 15th, they were back in Egypt. During the 19-day escape, the team had managed to avoid 30,000 German soldiers and literally out-mountained the elite German mountain troops. The kidnapping was a success and Kreipe was sent to a POW camp in Canada. For their outstanding display of courage and audacity, Fermor and Moss were given a Distinguished Service Order and a Military Cross respectively. But things weren't so shiny for the Cretans who helped them out. The Germans punished the villagers for supporting the kidnappers by burning houses down and massacring civilians. Moss couldn't live with this and was back in Crete within 2 months, fighting a guerrilla war against the German invaders. While resistance efforts in many other nations during the Second World War fell under the umbrellas of large, unified resistance movements, this wasn't so much the case in Germany. Before the war, and during its early stages, The German people were largely for Hitler, who they believed, in the wake of the Treaty of Versailles, would make Germany great again. As such, few wanted to resist him, while fear of arrest or execution dissuaded those who did. But that's not to say that no one in Germany stood against him. Far from it. In this video, we explore some of the major German groups and individuals who resisted Hitler and Nazism before and during the Second World War. While they weren't exactly taking up arms and marching on Hitler, Christian churches retained a degree of independence from the Nazi state and opposed many of Hitler's policies.
The Christian churches might have led ordinary Germans against the Nazis.
After Hitler seized power in 1933, he banned Catholic political parties and signed a treaty known as the Reichskonkordat with Pope Pius XI, which guaranteed the Catholic Church religious rights in Germany, but also restricted its political power. Author Anton Gill summarized it well in his book, An Honorable Defeat. Hitler intended to imprison the Catholics, as it were, in their own churches. They could celebrate Mass and retain their rituals as much as they liked, but they could have nothing to do at all with German society otherwise. Catholic schools and newspapers were closed, and a propaganda campaign against Catholics was launched. Many members of the church would not be silenced, however, and they were especially disgusted with Hitler's policies on euthanasia and sterilization. Among the Catholics who refused to be silenced was the Bishop of Münster, Clemens August Graf von Galen, who in 1933 used the terms of the Reichskonkordat against the Nazis to ensure the continuation of religious instruction in Catholic schools. In 1934, he began denouncing Nazi racial ideology during his sermons. Some of these were then printed and distributed illegally. In response, the SS paid Galen a visit, threatening to seize church property and begin an anti-Catholic propaganda campaign. This didn't faze Galen, whose impassioned sermons earned him the nickname Lion of Münster. Referencing one of Galen's 1941 sermons, author Robert J. Lifton wrote the following. This powerful, populist sermon was immediately reproduced and distributed throughout Germany. Indeed, it was dropped among German troops by British Royal Air Force flyers. Galen's sermon probably had a greater impact than any other one statement in consolidating anti-euthanasia sentiment. While he wasn't a bishop, the Catholic politician Erich Klausener also stood boldly against the Nazis. Klausener was one of the men who contributed to the writing of German Vice-Chancellor Franz von Pappen's June 1934 Marburg speech, largely considered the last major public speech made against Nazism in Germany before the war. Later that month, Klausener, as head of the Catholic Action Group Berlin, gave his own impassioned anti-Nazi speech in Hoppegarten. This action saw him murdered just 6 days later in the Night of the Long Knives. Protestant movements rose up against religious persecution as well. One of these movements was the Confessing Church, a group that opposed Hitler's plan of merging all of Germany's Protestant churches, i.e. non-Catholic churches, into one pro-Nazi state church. A Lutheran pastor named Dietrich Bonhoeffer was one of the Confessing Church's founding members and a vocal adversary of Nazi eugenics. Bonhoeffer held underground sermons in Germany in the 1930s and became a member of the German military intelligence organization, the Abwehr, using this position as cover so he could aid the German resistance. Along with other anti-Nazi conspirators working under the guise of the Abwehr, Bonhoeffer was later implicated in the failed 20 July plot and executed. If churches were one pillar of German resistance, the military was another. One German general who played a major role in the resistance was Hans Oster. Head of the Military Intelligence Office, Oster made it his mission to create a network of Nazi-hating personnel in the Wehrmacht and its intelligence arms. Among other prominent German military figures, this man was in league with the chief of the Abwehr, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, as well as the chief of staff of the German army, General Ludwig Beck. These men worked in secret to establish networks through which they could feed intelligence to other elements of the German resistance. They also fought Hitler more directly. Notably, Oster believed that the only way to truly defeat Hitler would be via a coup or to assassinate him. Before the war, in 1938, Oster tried to win the support of Britain and France before going ahead with his plan to overthrow Hitler, but they doubted Oster could actually do it and lent him no aid. In the lead up to Hitler's invasion of Czechoslovakia, Beck told Hitler it was a bad idea, so Hitler sacked him. One Franz Halder, who was also in contact with Oster, took Beck's place. Now that words had failed, Oster prepared to storm the Reich Chancellery to arrest or slay the Führer. But this plan, the Oster conspiracy, ultimately fell through because Germany moved on Sudetenland instead, leaving Poland to invade Czechoslovakia, and because Halder, while initially eager, refused to follow through with it. During the war, Oster and his fellow conspirators continued to plot against Hitler with the Abwehr chief Canaris protecting them as well as he could. Halder, however, very much feared Hitler, failing time and time again to take decisive action against him, much to the other conspirators' disappointment. To add to the difficulty of removing Hitler from power, he was very much winning the war in its early years, and many of his officers were pretty happy about that. A coup was the last thing on many of their minds. In 1944, by which time Hitler very much wasn't winning the war, Oster, Beck, and Canaris, along with a number of other high-ranking German conspirators, participated in Operation Valkyrie, or the 20 July plot, a failed assassination attempt and coup d'etat against Hitler. While the bomb that the conspirators placed wounded the Führer, it did not kill him. In retaliation, the Gestapo went out and arrested more than 7,000 suspects and executed almost 5,000 of them. Along with the aforementioned Lutheran pastor Bernhofer, Oster and Canaris swung from the ropes, while Beck ate lead. Halder was also arrested, but later on released, and he survived the war. German political groups also resisted Hitler, among them the groups which he banned when he came to power. These included, but weren't limited to, the Social Democratic Party of Germany and the Communist Party of Germany, or KPD. These groups largely maintained underground networks and distributed anti-Nazi propaganda. However, after Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the KDP became more active, undertaking espionage and sabotage operations. While not part of the KDP, the left-leaning Luftwaffe intelligence officer Harro Schütze-Boysen, the economist Arvid Hanak, and the journalist Adam Kukov led their own resistance movement against Hitler and fascism in league with the other resistance groups the Gestapo loosely defined as the Red Orchestra. While there were likely more people affiliated with the Red Orchestra, some 400 are known by name. The Schütze-Boysen group resisted by gathering evidence of Nazi war crimes, passing this information on to foreign nations, spreading anti-Nazi propaganda via leaflets and pamphlets, and assisting those persecuted by Hitler's sadistic regime. After the German Communist and Red Orchestra member Johann Wenzel informed on Schütze-Boysen and Hanak during a good old torture session, the Gestapo arrested those two men. They were executed on the 22nd of December 1941, while the journalist Kukov was put to death in August 1943. Germans didn't need to be directly involved with the church, the military, or political groups to resist Nazism, however. The White Rose was a non-violent resistance group led by students from the University of Munich, including, but not limited to, Sophie Scholl and her brother Hans. The White Rose resisted Hitler by means of anti-Nazi leaflets and pamphlets and graffiti. One of their leaflets reads as follows: "Since the conquest of Poland, 300,000 Jews have been murdered in this country in the most bestial way. The German people slumber on in dull, stupid sleep and encourage the fascist criminals. Each wants to be exonerated of guilt. Each one continues on his way with the most placid, calm conscience. But he cannot be exonerated. He is guilty, guilty, guilty." While distributing leaflets at the university in February 1943, Sophie and Hans were ratted out by the uni's maintenance man, Jakob Schmidt. The Gestapo came for them, and just a few days later, the two siblings and one other White Rose member were executed by freaking guillotine at Stadtdelheim prison. Before the blade fell, Hans cried out, "Long live freedom." Of course, the German resistance, while not operating under a single banner, was far more extensive than what we've covered in this video. There were many other groups that resisted Hitler, as there were many instances of everyday resistance, such as Germans hiding out and otherwise assisting Jews, and young Germans evading the Hitler Youth and engaging in counterculture. Excitable and temperamental, impulsive and hasty. These are a few traits you probably wouldn't associate with one of the most celebrated female spies of the Second World War, but you'd be wrong. Brought into the whole spy game basically on accident, this French woman's life was full of pain and dumb, weird luck. We're of course referring to Odette Sampson or Odette Churchill, or Odette, whatever her last name was, whose story we're going to share with you now. Born Odette Marie-Léon Céline Breil in 1912 in the city of Amiens, France, Odette would come to know tremendous pain very early in her life. At just 8 years of age, her father was killed in the Great War, and she was also blinded by disease for over 3 years, for which she spent the majority in bed. Despite her weakened state, she was still a bit of a headstrong terror, proving to be a handful for her family. Leaving her illness in the dust and becoming a woman, Odette married an Englishman in 1931 and followed him across the English Channel to Britain. By the time World War II broke out, Odette had popped out 3 children, and when the bells were rung, her husband went and joined the army. Their marriage basically went south from there. A few years into the war, with Odette's homeland well and truly crushed, she was probably feeling pretty good about her decision to move to Britain. In 1942, the British government department responsible for the command of the Royal Navy asked anyone with photos of the French coastline to post them in. Odette, being French, had some gram-worthy photos and decided they would get more likes if the government posted them, with proper credit, of course. But in a classic Odette move, she sent them to the wrong bloody department. Heads were shaken, and her letter ended up with the Special Operations Executive instead. Through sheer luck, or is it ill luck, she was subsequently asked to try out as an SOE agent, her French heritage being of great use to the SOE, as if she accepted, she would operate in France. Despite being a little excitable, temperamental, impulsive and hasty, and despite the fact that the SOE said that she was completely willing to admit that she could ever be wrong, Odette was also determined and keenly patriotic. They took her on, teaching her how to end lives, endure torture, and operate in enemy-occupied territory before shipping her to France, where, after a bit of a shake-up to her original plan, she made contact with the leader of the Caen-based SOE network, Spindle, one Peter Churchill. For over a year, having been assigned the codenamed Lys, Odette worked as a courier and radio operator, essentially helping the French resistance communicate with the SOE and stay in the fight. In this time, Odette became good buddies with the aforementioned Peter Churchill. Early in 1943, the German Gestapo were bloodhounds on Spindle's scent, and Odette fled with Churchill to the village of Saint-Goriot on the Italian border. While she might have escaped the hounds, another, more stealthy creature had set its sights upon her. An Abwehr spy hunter by the name of Hugo Bleicher, posing as a disaffected German soldier, was working to infiltrate what remained of Spindle. After meeting with Odette, he detected a whiff of her lie, and on the 15th of April 1943, Odette and Churchill had an unannounced visitor arrive at their hotel. It was Bleicher, of course, accompanied by several Italian soldiers. Pain was what Odette had in store for her now, but she would never break. Odette's great suffering began in the Fresnes prison near the French capital. Kept in solitary confinement, her only visitor was the spy hunter Bleicher. He wanted to do things the easy way at first, using words and cold hard cash to try and persuade Odette to talk, but none of that worked. She was subsequently moved to the Gestapo HQ at 84 Avenue Foch, where the physical pain began. After refusing to give up her fellow spies, she was tortured. Among other things, they ripped out all of her toenails and pressed a red-hot poker into her back. On top of this, deprivations were taking a toll on her body, but Odette endured, and even had the wit to come up with a bit of a ruse. Thinking on her toes, she convinced the Gestapo that she was married to Spindle's leader, Peter Churchill, and that he, Peter, was related to Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister. While this worked out well for Peter Churchill, who, now a bargaining chip, was moved to Berlin, and while the prison guards treated Odette a little better, Odette was still neck deep in the excrement. Refusing to crack, she incurred the wrath of the spy hunter Bleicher, who deported her to the women's concentration camp at Ravensbrück, where she was to be executed for not one, but 2 so-called crimes. To this, she said, "Make up your mind on what count I am to be executed, because I can only die once." As you might have imagined, Ravensbrück was excrement too. Odette was held in a pitch black cell in a bunker where she was fed just enough to stay just above the cold waters of death. Having been blind in her youth, Odette was able to adapt somewhat to her predicament, but she still suffered more than most of us could imagine. She had dysentery and scurvy, her body was covered in scabs, her hair and teeth were falling out. They even artificially heated her cell, making it all the more unbearable. At one point, she was moved to a different cell near the crematorium. Here, she could smell the bodies burning and even heard screaming as if they were cremating some inmates alive. What kept her going was the prospect that she might, however unlikely it was, live to see her children again. She also remained focused on the here and now and not too far in the future. If she could, in her own words, survive the minute without breaking up, then that was another minute of life. When the Allies liberated France in August 1944, Ravensbrück camp commandant Fritz Sören tried to pull a fast one, taking Odette and driving to an American base in the hopes that with Odette's connections to Winston Churchill, he could strike a deal and avoid execution. This was, unfortunately for Fritz, not the case. He swung from a rope in 1950. As for Odette, she was free, but wasn't looking so good. After being returned to Britain, she underwent months of medical rehabilitation and also learned that Peter Churchill had survived, all because of their ruse. After the war, Odette received a range of honours, including but not limited to the British George Cross and the French Legion of Honour, and testified against various war criminals, including the 1000 IQ Fritz Sören. Evidently, Odette's relationship with Peter Churchill grew pretty steamy after the war, as she dumped her husband and married Peter in 1947, becoming Odette Churchill for real this time. It was a wedding of spies and was quite popular in the media in both Britain and France. But it didn't last. 9 years later, she gave Churchill the sack too. She married a former SOE officer that same year, becoming, finally, Odette Hallowes, whom she perished as in 1995 at 82 years of age.